Imagine standing where New York City should be, but instead of skyscrapers, there's a wall of ice a kilometre thick pressing down on the bedrock. London is buried. The North Sea doesn't exist. You could walk from Britain to France across a frozen plain scattered with the bones of woolly mammoths. The Amazon is drier, the Sahara is greener, and the oceans sit nearly 120 metres lower than they do today, exposing vast shelves of land that modern maps don't even show. This wasn't fantasy. This was Earth roughly 20,000 years ago, and for most of the last 2.5 million years, conditions something like this were the default state of the planet. Then, around 11,000 years ago, the ice retreated, temperatures climbed. The great glaciers melted back, the seas rose, and the world we know today gradually came into focus. Agriculture appeared. Cities followed, empires rose and fell. Everything that we call civilization, language, religion, trade, war, science, unfolded in that narrow window of warmth we call the Holocene. But what if that window never opened? What if the glaciers held? What if the orbital cycles, the ocean currents, and the atmospheric chemistry conspired to keep the planet locked in permanent glacial conditions, and humanity, already present and already surprisingly resourceful, had to build whatever it could in a world that never warmed? That's the question we're exploring here, and it's stranger and more consequential than it might first appear. This isn't just a story about being cold. The permanent continuation of Ice Age conditions would reshape the entire map of the Earth. Coastlines, rivers, deserts, forests, all of them dramatically rearranged. It would alter the fundamental logic of where people could live, what they could eat, and how large a group could realistically survive in a single place. It would change the trajectory of agriculture, delay or redirect the formation of cities, and force any emerging civilization to develop technology not in response to abundance, but in desperate negotiation with scarcity and cold. The consequences ripple outward from there. Trade routes would follow different coastlines and different river valleys. The geography of power would belong to whoever controlled the narrow habitable corridors between the ice. Religion and myth would be shaped by a world where the sky is often grey. The growing season is brutally short, and the glacier on the horizon never moves. Even the psychology of civilizations, their relationship to time, to nature, to survival, would carry the imprint of an eternal winter. What makes this thought experiment worth taking seriously is that we're not speculating from nothing. We have ice cores, pollen records, genetic evidence, and archaeological finds that paint a surprisingly detailed picture of how the world looked and how people actually lived during the last glacial maximum. We know which regions stayed warm enough to support life. We know which animals humans hunted and which plants they relied on. We have a scientific foundation to build from. So what follows is a grounded reconstruction, not a fantasy, but a carefully reasoned exploration of what Earth and its human inhabitants might look like if the ice never let go. What kind of civilization could emerge? What kind of person would it produce? And could it, against all odds, eventually look something like our own? Let's find out. Before we can explore what a world locked in permanent glaciation would look like, we need to be precise about what we're actually imagining, because Ice Age is one of those terms that means something more specific than popular culture usually suggests. The last glacial maximum, the period around 20,000 years ago when ice reached its greatest extent, wasn't the planet frozen solid from pole to equator. It was a world roughly 4 to 7 degrees Celsius colder on average than today. That might sound modest, but those few degrees cascaded into consequences that reshaped entire continents. Ice sheets stretched from Scandinavia deep into Central Europe, and across North America from the Arctic down through what is now the northern United States. But vast regions, including much of Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America, remained largely ice-free, if considerably drier and cooler than today. The planet was cold and compressed, but it was not dead. This matters enormously for our thought experiment. When we ask what happens if the ice never ended, we're not asking about a snowball Earth, that much more extreme scenario where runaway glaciation covers the globe in ice from the poles nearly to the tropics. Snowball Earth events have likely occurred, but they require conditions quite different from the relatively recent Pleistocene cycles we're working with here. A plausibly extended last ice age is something more nuanced and more survivable, enduring continental ice sheets, sea levels remaining roughly 100 to 120 meters lower than today, global temperatures averaging several degrees below the Holocene norm, and precipitation patterns dramatically redistributed. More arid in some tropical zones, altered monsoons, and a general shift in where the world's moisture actually falls. So what would sustain such a state indefinitely? The mechanics of glaciation involve several interlocking forces. Earth's orbit is not constant. It wobbles, tilts and traces different paths around the Sun over cycles of tens of thousands of years. These are called Milankovitch cycles, and they modulate how much solar energy reaches different latitudes at different times of year. The warming that ended the last ice age was fundamentally driven by a favourable orbital configuration that increased summer solar radiation in the northern hemisphere, triggering ice sheet retreat. In our alternate scenario, that orbital shift either doesn't happen or happens at a moment too brief or too mild to tip the balance. But orbital geometry alone doesn't explain everything, because the climate system amplifies whatever signal it receives. Ice and snow reflect sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it, a property called albedo. The more ice there is, the more sunlight gets reflected. The cooler the surface stays, and the more ice persists. This feedback loop is one of the reasons glacial periods are so stable once established. The system actively resists warming. Ocean circulation also plays a role, with cold freshwater from ice melt capable of disrupting the currents that carry heat to the high latitudes. Greenhouse gas concentrations, particularly carbon dioxide and methane, remain lower during glacial periods. Ice core records confirm that atmospheric CO2 during the last glacial maximum sat around 180 parts per million, compared to the 280 that characterized most of the Holocene before industrialization. Lower greenhouse gas levels mean the atmosphere traps less heat, reinforcing the cold. In a world where these feedbacks never released their grip, where the orbital nudge was too weak, the albedo loop too entrenched, and greenhouse concentrations never recovered, the ice holds. Not as a catastrophe, not as an apocalypse, but as a persistent and demanding equilibrium. That's the world we're imagining, not hell frozen over, but a planet stubbornly committed to a colder, drier, more constrained version of itself. A planet where habitable land is real but limited, where biological productivity exists but within tighter boundaries, and where any species clever enough to work within those limits could, in theory, begin building something. Whether humanity could rise to that challenge depends on understanding the terrain it would actually face. And that starts with looking at what the map of this frozen Earth would really look like. Pull up any map of the modern world, and what you're actually looking at is an artifact of warmth. The coastlines, the islands, the channels and seas. They exist where they do because 10,000 years of relatively stable, relatively warm climate melted enough ice to raise global sea levels by roughly 100 to 120 meters. Take that warming away, lock those sea levels down, and the map transforms in ways that are genuinely disorienting. The single most dramatic change is how much land appears. When sea levels drop by that magnitude, continental shelves, those broad, shallow underwater platforms that extend outward from most coastlines before the ocean floor, plunges into the deep, emerge from the water entirely. These aren't narrow strips of beach. In some parts of the world they extend hundreds of kilometers. The result is a planet with substantially more dry land than the one we inhabit, and in strategically crucial places. Start with Southeast Asia, which offers perhaps the most striking transformation of any region on Earth. Today, The islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula are separated by the shallow Java Sea and the Strait of Malacca. In an Ice Age world, those waters largely vanish. What remains is an enormous continuous landmass that geologists already have a name for: Sunderland. A territory roughly the size of Western Europe emerges as a single connected plain, linking the modern island chains into a vast lowland peninsula extending southward from mainland Asia. The islands we know today would be reduced to hills and mountain ranges rising above that expanded coastal margin. This single change rewrites the geography of an entire region. Movement that today requires boats, in a frozen world, requires only walking. Something similar happens in the North Atlantic and across the Arctic margins of Eurasia and North America. The Bering Land Bridge, which we know connected Siberia to Alaska during the last glacial maximum, would remain a permanent feature, not a narrow crossing, but a substantial landmass, sometimes called Beringia, wide enough to support its own ecosystems. Britain, still an island today, largely because of rising post-glacial seas, would remain attached to continental Europe. The English Channel doesn't exist. The North Sea is a plain. Ireland sits at the edge of an expanded Atlantic coast, rather than floating in its own sea. Doggerland, the sunken territory beneath the southern North Sea, is dry, habitable, and connected to both Britain and the European mainland. Around Australia, the continental shelf exposure joins that continent more closely to New Guinea, creating what researchers sometimes call Sahul, an enlarged landmass that changes the geometry of movement through the Pacific margins. The Persian Gulf largely disappears, becoming a river-valley system draining into the Indian Ocean far to the south. Hudson Bay in North America drains and becomes land, though much of it would lie beneath glacial ice rather than being freely accessible. That brings us to the other side of the equation, because not all this new land would be welcoming. The ice sheets themselves occupy vast territories that, in our actual timeline, have long since become some of the world's most productive agricultural regions. The Laurentide ice sheet across North America covers what is today the American Midwest, the Great Lakes region, New England, and much of Canada in kilometers thick ice. Scandinavia and the British Isles lie beneath the Fennoscandian ice sheet. The Alps carry expanded glaciers pushing down into surrounding lowlands. Patagonia is heavily glaciated. The Tibetan Plateau carries ice far beyond its modern extent. These aren't places where anyone lives. They're dead zones, geologically active in the sense that glaciers grind and reshape bedrock, but biologically minimal at their cores. Their immediate margins, the periglacial zones where the ice retreats seasonally or not at all, are harsh, cold, and often characterized by permafrost. Ground permanently frozen below the surface that prevents tree growth and limits what can survive above it. But here the story gets more complicated, because the Ice Age world is not uniformly hostile. Between the ice sheets in the northern hemisphere and the drier, cooler tropical regions farther south, there exist vast areas of mammoth steppe, a biome that doesn't really have a modern equivalent. It's a cold grassland, often arid, supporting surprising biological productivity, large herds of grazing animals, diverse grass species, and an ecosystem that, while demanding, is far from empty. Stretching across unglaciated parts of Siberia, Central Asia, and portions of North America south of the ice margins, the mammoth steppe represents the most productive land in the higher latitudes of a glaciated world. It's cold, it's windy, it's subject to brutal winters, but it feeds things, and things that can feed themselves in it have a foundation for survival. Further south, the tropical regions remain largely ice-free, but lower temperatures and dramatically altered precipitation patterns reshape them considerably. Parts of the Sahara and the broader African interior that are already arid become more so. Glacial periods tend to suppress the monsoon systems that bring moisture to sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But the compression isn't total. Refugia, pockets of relative productivity, persist along coastlines, river valleys, and elevated regions where orographic rainfall maintains local moisture even as surrounding areas dry out. East Africa, the Levant, parts of Southeast Asia, and the expanded coastal margins of the new land masses all offer zones where biological complexity survives. For human movement and eventual settlement, the physical consequences of this new map are profound in ways that ripple forward through everything else. Natural barriers are removed in some places and created in others. The land bridge connections across Beringia, across Sunderland, across a connected Britain and Europe mean that populations can move continuously through land corridors that in our world require maritime technology to cross. There are no early sea crossings needed to reach what we call the Americas. You walk. The movement of people, ideas, animals, and eventually trade goods follows paths that simply don't exist in our warmer world. Conversely, the mountain ranges and ice sheet margins that do exist become the defining barriers of geography. The Alps, more heavily glaciated and surrounded by colder lowlands, form a harder wall between the Mediterranean and northern Europe than they do today. The Himalayas, already formidable, anchor a vast glacial complex that restricts movement between South Asia and Central Asia even more severely. Rivers draining from ice sheet margins create boggy, difficult terrain in transition zones. What this means at the most fundamental level is that the first mental map any human group would construct of their world, the geography of where you can go, where food exists, where danger comes from, where strangers live, would be structured around entirely different physical realities. Settlements would cluster along different coasts, trade would follow different rivers. Mountains would mean different things. The sea itself, when it exists, is smaller, colder, and shallower, and the fishing grounds it offers are organized differently. Every civilization that might emerge from this world would be shaped by a physical stage that doesn't match ours in any straightforward way. The places that become centers of power, the routes that become highways of commerce, the natural resources that become foundations of early economies, all of it originates in this different map. And understanding that map is the first step toward understanding what kind of world and what kind of humanity might have developed within it. So you have this new map, more land, less sea, ice pushing down from the poles and crowding everything southward. But a map is static. What actually happens when you run the climate system on top of it? What does the atmosphere do when a third or more of the northern hemisphere's land surface is buried under kilometers of ice indefinitely, with no prospect of retreat? The short answer is that everything gets harder and stranger. The long answer requires understanding that climate is not just temperature, it's circulation, pressure, moisture, feedback, and the endless negotiation between land, ice, ocean, and air. Start with temperature, because that's the most intuitive piece. Global average temperatures during the last glacial maximum were roughly 6 to 8 degrees Celsius cooler than today. That might sound modest, until you consider what it means in practice. Temperature differences in climate systems aren't distributed evenly. They amplify at the poles and moderate toward the equator, and they interact with elevation, proximity to water, and albedo in ways that create enormous regional variation. The northern continents, already land-dominated and far from the ocean's moderating influence, would be ferociously cold in winter. Parts of continental Asia and North America, sitting in the interior of their respective land masses, would experience winters that dwarf anything those regions see today. We're talking about sustained, multi-month cold so severe that even the mammoth steppes' impressive cold-adapted fauna would be pressed toward survival limits during the deepest months of the year. Seasonality itself intensifies. One of the underappreciated effects of permanent glaciation is that it sharpens the contrast between summer and winter rather than simply making both colder. Ice sheets are extraordinarily effective at reflecting solar energy. Their high albedo bounces sunlight back into space that would otherwise warm the surface. In winter, this is almost irrelevant because there's little sunlight reaching high latitudes anyway. But in summer, it becomes a powerful brake on warming. The result is a world where summers remain shorter, cooler, and less able to penetrate deeply into continental interiors, while winters extend their grip further into what should be the shoulder seasons. Spring arrives later, autumn comes sooner. The window of biological productivity in the mid to high latitudes narrows considerably, with cascading effects on everything from plant growing seasons to animal migration timing. Now add the jet stream, and things get genuinely interesting. The polar jet stream, that fast-moving ribbon of air in the upper atmosphere that drives much of the weather in the mid-latitudes, is shaped by the temperature contrast between polar and tropical air masses. In a world with a much larger and more persistent cold polar zone, that temperature gradient steepens. A steeper gradient means a stronger, faster, and potentially more southward displaced jet stream. This has enormous consequences for storm tracks, the paths that low-pressure systems follow as they drag moisture from the oceans across the continents. In our world, storms carried by the jet stream bring crucial precipitation to Western Europe, the eastern United States, and parts of Asia. In a permanent Ice Age world, those storm tracks shift equatorward and may become more concentrated and more intense along particular corridors, leaving some regions wetter than they might otherwise expect, while bypassing others almost entirely. Ocean circulation adds another layer of complexity. The thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the ocean conveyor belt, depends on the sinking of cold, salty water in the North Atlantic, which drives a planetary-scale movement of heat and nutrients through the world's oceans. During glacial periods, the production of sea ice and the altered positions of ice sheet margins can disrupt where this sinking occurs and how vigorously it operates. Some evidence from glacial period sediment cores suggests the Atlantic circulation was weaker or organized differently during the last glacial maximum, with consequences for how much heat was carried northward toward Europe and the Arctic margins. A permanently glaciated world might sustain a version of this circulation, but its configuration could differ enough from our own to alter the climates of entire ocean basins, including the temperature and productivity of the seas themselves. Here's where the intuition breaks down for most people. In a world covered by more ice, shouldn't everywhere be wetter? Shouldn't there be more snowfall, more precipitation, more moisture locked into the system? The counterintuitive answer is no, and the reason is that cold air holds less moisture than warm air. The glaciated northern hemisphere is, in large parts of its interior, drier than it looks. Ice cores and sediment records from the actual last glacial maximum suggest that interior regions of North America and Eurasia were frequently cold and arid simultaneously, not the snow-blanketed forests of popular imagination, but frigid, wind-scoured landscapes where precipitation was low and what fell was locked away by cold rather than cycling actively through the system. The great ice sheets themselves were not built on heavy, ongoing snowfall in most regions. They accumulated slowly over millennia because what fell didn't melt. Meanwhile, the reduction in ocean surface area and the cooling of sea surface temperatures suppresses evaporation, which is the engine that drives precipitation globally. Less evaporation means less moisture in the atmosphere overall. The monsoon systems that deliver rainfall to South Asia, West Africa, and parts of the Americas weaken or shift. Regions that depend on summer monsoon moisture become dramatically drier, not colder. The Sahara, rather than becoming snowbound, may expand and intensify as an arid zone. The Indian subcontinent receives less seasonal rainfall. The interiors of continents become cold deserts as much as cold forests. What emerges from all of this is not a stable, uniformly frozen planet, but something far more volatile, a world of unstable edges, the boundaries between ice and not ice, between the frigid continental interiors and the marginally warmer coasts, between regions that receive storm-track precipitation and those that sit in rain shadows. These zones are not fixed lines. They shift seasonally, they shift across decades, and in a world already stressed by the enormous energetic imbalances created by expanded ice cover, they may shift abruptly. Paleoclimate records from actual glacial periods include evidence of rapid regional climate changes, events where temperatures in Greenland appear to have shifted by several degrees within decades, driven by changes in ocean circulation or ice sheet dynamics. In a permanently glaciated world, these kinds of abrupt swings might be a recurring feature rather than an occasional anomaly. For any civilization trying to build itself in this world, the climate system itself would be an adversary of a particular kind, not just cold, but unpredictable. Agricultural planning, settlement location, the management of food stores and water supplies, the reading of seasonal signs, all of it would have to account for a system that delivers genuine surprises. Regional contrasts would be sharper and more consequential. A community sitting on the right side of a storm track, near a coastline with enough ocean moderating its winters, might flourish. One sitting just beyond that zone in the interior cold might face a fundamentally different existence. Where you could actually live in this world and how you could survive there wasn't a question with many comfortable answers. That last point deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not as an abstract observation about climate modelling, but as a concrete question about human geography. Where exactly could people actually live? Not just survive in the extreme sense of enduring a brutal season, but build something lasting, raise children, accumulate knowledge, develop the kind of social complexity that eventually becomes civilization. The answer in a permanently glaciated world involves a map that is strikingly narrower than anything we know. Begin with what's simply off the table. The great ice sheets of North America, the Laurentide ice sheet in our actual glacial maximum, covered virtually everything north of a line running roughly through the present-day northern United States. In a world where that ice never retreated, Canada as we know it doesn't exist as livable territory. It's buried. The Great Lakes region, the St. Lawrence Valley, the boreal forests of Ontario and Quebec, all of it sits under kilometres of ice or in the frigid periglacial fringe just beyond the glacier's edge, where permafrost and tundra dominate, and where the growing season, such as it is, lasts only weeks. Northern Europe faces the same fate. Scandinavia, Britain, much of it submerged under the Fennoscandian ice sheet, and the broad plains of northern Germany and Poland reduced to cold, windswept outwash zones. Russia's vast northern territory, already formidable in our own time, becomes something approaching uninhabitable for any sustained population. This is not just an inconvenience. These are some of the most agriculturally productive and densely settled regions in our own history. Remove them, and you've excised enormous swaths of what eventually became the heartlands of European and North American civilization. The pressure this places on remaining habitable zones is difficult to overstate. So where does that leave humanity? The most promising zones are, by necessity, those sitting at the glacial margins or in the mid-latitude refugia that escape the worst of both the ice and the interior cold. River valleys are among the most important of these. A river carries more than water. It carries the moderating thermal influence of moving water, which resists freezing longer than standing water and creates a microclimate corridor that can support vegetation and animal life well beyond what the surrounding uplands permit. The great river systems of the mid-latitudes, the ancestors of the Mississippi in its lower reaches, the Rhine below the ice margin, the Danube across Central Europe, the great rivers flowing south from the Himalayas and the Central Asian highlands, would serve as lifelines, literal corridors of habitability, threading through landscapes that are otherwise marginal or hostile. South-facing lowlands matter enormously in this world, in ways that most people in our own climate take for granted. In the northern hemisphere, slopes and valleys that open to the south receive more direct solar radiation than those facing north, a difference that in our climate is a minor comfort, and in a glacially cooled world becomes the difference between a place that can support winter season grazing and one that cannot. Communities would develop an acute sensitivity to topography, seeking out the south-facing valleys, the sheltered basins, the spots where cold air drainage flows away from the settlement rather than pooling in it. This kind of microgeographic selection is already visible in the archaeological record of actual glacial period human sites. People weren't randomly distributed across landscapes. They clustered in the places where the land itself provided some defense against the cold. Coastal refugia represent perhaps the single most important category of habitable space in this world. Coastlines are moderated by the ocean's thermal inertia. The sea warms and cools more slowly than the land, which means coastal zones experience less extreme temperature swings in both directions. During the actual last glacial maximum, ice-free coastal strips persisted in some surprising places, and there's serious archaeological debate about whether coastal routes allowed human movement along margins of ice sheets that were impassable inland. In a world where glaciation is permanent, these coastal strips become even more critical. They're not just migration corridors, but permanent habitation zones, places where marine resources supplement terrestrial ones and where the climate remains just bearable enough to sustain year-round communities. The Pacific coast of North America, south of the ice margin, would be one such zone. The Atlantic coasts of southern Europe and northwestern Africa would be another. The Mediterranean basin, sitting at lower latitudes and insulated by the sea itself, becomes extraordinarily valuable real estate. The Mediterranean deserves particular emphasis. In our own glacial maximum, the Mediterranean was cooler and somewhat more arid than today, but it remained vegetated and habitable, and it was home to some of the most significant refugia in which European flora, fauna, and human populations sheltered during glacial cold. In a world where the ice never retreats, the Mediterranean basin, the coastlines of what we call Spain, France, Italy, Greece, North Africa, the Levant, becomes the premier zone of human habitation in the Western world. It has sea access, moderate temperatures, seasonal rainfall from storm tracks pushed equatorward, and the kind of ecological diversity that supports varied subsistence strategies. The same logic applies in East Asia, where the coastlines of southern China, the Korean peninsula's southern reaches, and the Japanese archipelago would likely support significant populations in positions analogous to what the Mediterranean offers in the West. The net result of all this is a dramatic funneling effect, populations compressed into narrower latitudinal bands than anything in our own history. In our timeline, humans spread from the equator to well beyond the Arctic Circle, occupying virtually every ecological zone on Earth with remarkable breadth. In a permanent Ice Age world, the habitable zone shrinks decisively toward the mid-latitudes and the tropics, with the glacial margins creating hard barriers and the interior continental zones remaining too cold and too dry for dense, stable populations. Human habitation becomes, in a sense, a coastal and riverine phenomenon, to a degree far exceeding anything we've experienced. What this means for population density in those favoured zones is complex. More people competing for fewer suitable locations might drive greater social complexity, or it might create chronic resource stress and conflict. It almost certainly produces populations with a deeply sophisticated environmental literacy, people who can read river behaviour, who understand the microclimatic logic of valley orientation, who have developed detailed knowledge of coastal ecology and seasonal marine patterns. That knowledge is a form of intelligence that accumulates over generations, and in a world where the wrong choice of settlement location could mean death, the selection pressure to get it right would be intense. Geography in this world isn't backdrop, it's destiny, and the people navigating it would know that in their bones. So we've established where people could live. But how did they get there? And how did they move between these scattered refugia when the world between them was often ice, tundra, or bitterly cold steppe? The story of human dispersal in a world where glaciation never ends is one of both constraint and unexpected opportunity, of corridors opening and closing like doors in a shifting architectural maze. Start with the most dramatic difference from our own world, sea level. During the actual last glacial maximum, global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters below where they stand today. That's not a minor adjustment, it's a transformation of the world map. Vast continental shelves that are now ocean floor were exposed as dry land, and in a timeline where the ice never melts, that water never returns. The shallow seas between what we know as islands and mainlands remain bridged. Sunderland, the enormous landmass connecting mainland Southeast Asia to Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the surrounding islands, stays above water. Sahul, the joined continent of Australia and New Guinea, remains accessible from island-hopping routes that are far shorter than anything people face today. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe doesn't fill in. The Bering Land Bridge, Beringia, doesn't disappear beneath the waves. That last one reshapes everything about the human story in the Americas. In our own history, Beringia existed as a broad, grassy steppe corridor during glacial periods and was then flooded as ice melted and sea levels rose. People crossed it, reached the Americas, and the land bridge eventually closed. In this frozen world, Beringia never floods. It remains a permanent feature of the planet's geography, a wide windswept connection between Northeast Asia and Northwest North America. Not just a temporary path, but an enduring passageway. Movement between Asia and the Americas in this timeline isn't a one-time migration event, followed by thousands of years of isolation. It's an ongoing relationship with populations moving back and forth across a land connection that persists indefinitely. What this probably means is that the Americas receive multiple, overlapping waves of migration rather than being settled by a single founding population that gradually diversifies in isolation. Genetic and cultural exchange between Asia and the Americas would continue, slowly given the harshness of the Beringian environment, but consistently. The deep genetic and linguistic divergence that characterizes indigenous American populations in our own timeline, the product of long isolation after the land bridge flooded, might look very different here. There could be closer, more recent connections to Siberian and East Asian populations, a shallower divergence time, and perhaps a more complex mosaic of population histories in the far northwest of the continent. But, and this is where the frozen world bites back, movement into the Americas isn't simply open. In our timeline, there's ongoing debate about how people got south of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets once they'd crossed Beringia. The ice-free corridor through the interior of North America was not always passable, and the coastal route along the Pacific margin has gathered significant support as the likely path for early movement southward. In a world where those ice sheets never retreat, the interior corridor stays closed. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets remain pressed against each other, leaving no gap through the continent's heart. The Pacific coastal route, threading along the ice margin just above the sea, becomes not a debated possibility but the only viable pathway south. It's narrow, cold, and demanding, but it works, and populations moving along it would develop extraordinary expertise in coastal subsistence, the kind of deep marine knowledge that becomes foundational to cultures throughout Western North America and eventually Central and South America. South of the ice margin, the Americas are reachable, and much of what we'd recognize as the continental United States from roughly the current northern tier downward remains accessible, though colder and drier than what we know. The Mississippi Valley, the Gulf Coast, the western river systems, and eventually the tropical zones of Mexico and Central America would all be reachable to people patient enough and skilled enough to navigate the coastal path and push inland where conditions allowed. In Eurasia, migration patterns operate under a different set of constraints. The Fennoscandian ice sheet and its eastern extensions create a hard barrier across northern Europe and much of Siberia, but the movement corridors that survive are in some ways more navigable than those in North America. The great latitudinal plains of central Eurasia, squeezed between the ice margin to the north and the elevated arid zones to the south, form a kind of cold steppe highway, harsh but passable to people with the right technology and cultural knowledge. Movement between Europe and Asia across this corridor doesn't require threading a narrow coastal strip. It operates across a broad, if frigid zone. What it does require is adaptation to steppe conditions, mobility skill with large herd animals, and the ability to cover long distances with minimal fixed infrastructure. The ice margins themselves create a particular dynamic that's worth understanding carefully. Glaciers don't simply sit still, even in a world where the overall trend is permanent glaciation. There are seasonal oscillations and longer-term fluctuations in where exactly the ice margin sits. These fluctuations create bottlenecks and population traps. A group that migrates into a marginal zone during a slightly warmer period might find, a few generations later, that advancing ice has cut them off from the populations they came from. Isolation of this kind is one of the primary engines of cultural and linguistic divergence. Small populations separated from their parent groups drift genetically and culturally, developing distinct identities over centuries. A world with permanent glaciation would be, paradoxically, a world with more of this kind of enforced isolation, as ice advance and retreat repeatedly pinches off communities from their larger networks. This dynamic might explain, in this hypothetical world, a pattern of striking cultural diversity in small geographic areas, linguistic and cultural differentiation, that in our world takes millennia of geographic spread to produce, might develop more rapidly in populations that are repeatedly isolated by glacial advance, then reconnected during retreats, then isolated again. The result could be something like the extraordinary linguistic diversity found along the Pacific coast of North America in our own timeline. Dozens of distinct language families packed into relatively small territories, the product of deep time, isolation, and complex patterns of contact and separation. In a permanently glaciated world, that kind of fragmentation might characterize much of the habitable margin, not just one coast. There's one more counterintuitive element to migration in this frozen world. Sometimes the ice made things faster. Exposed continental shelves are flat. They're often firm. They're not broken by the bays, inlets, and river systems that complicate coastal movement on today's shorelines. Moving across Beringia, across the now exposed North Sea plain, across Sunderland's broad lowlands, these would have been, in geographic terms, easier long-distance travel than picking through the complex terrain of modern coastlines. The world has fewer barriers in some directions because the sea that normally creates them hasn't arrived yet. In those directions, migration could proceed with surprising speed, populations fanning out across exposed lowland plains before the complications of climate and terrain slowed them at the inevitable margins. What emerges from all of this is a human world that is simultaneously more constrained and more intricate than our own. Populations channeled into narrower corridors, repeatedly isolated and reconnected by a living, shifting boundary of ice, and moving with unexpected swiftness across terrain that our ocean-covered maps make us forget even existed. The world those migrating populations moved through wasn't empty. It was alive in ways that are genuinely difficult to picture from the vantage point of a warmer, quieter planet. Step back out of the abstract geography of corridors and coastlines and into the actual landscape, the cold steppe stretching to the horizon, the permafrost underfoot, the air carrying the smell of wet grass and dung and wood smoke, and you begin to understand that the permanently glaciated world isn't a barren wasteland. It's a different kind of abundance, structured by cold, built around different relationships between grass and animal and human, and in some ways more richly stocked with large edible life than anything the warmer Holocene would eventually produce. The ecology of the full glacial world runs on what scientists have called the mammoth steppe, a biome that stretched, in our own timeline's glacial maximum, from Western Europe across Siberia and into North America, covering more territory than any ecosystem on Earth today. It was a cold, dry, highly productive grassland, more diverse than the word steppe tends to suggest, supporting a remarkable density of large herbivores, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, wild horses, reindeer, musk oxen, giant deer, and cave lions shared this landscape in numbers that rivaled anything the African savanna could claim. The key to the system was grass, cold-resistant, wind-pollinated, capable of surviving temperatures that would kill most trees, and rich enough in nutrition to fuel enormous bodies through long winters. In a world where the ice never retreats, this biome doesn't disappear. It doesn't contract and fragment as forests push northward and replace open grassland. It persists, perhaps slightly altered in its exact distribution, but structurally intact, covering vast portions of Eurasia and North America in a mosaic of productive cold steppe habitat. What that means for megafauna survival is genuinely significant. In our own timeline, the great extinctions of large animals that swept through the Americas, Australia, and eventually parts of Eurasia at the end of the Pleistocene were driven by some combination of human hunting pressure and the radical transformation of habitats as warming destroyed the ecological systems those animals depended on. The mammoth steppe fragmented, forests replaced grassland. The food web that supported mammoths and rhinos and giant ground sloths collapsed structurally, and hunting finished off populations that habitat loss had already stressed. In this frozen world, the habitat doesn't transform. The mammoth steppe endures. That doesn't make megafauna extinction impossible. Human hunters are formidable regardless of climate, but it removes the double pressure that in our timeline proved fatal. Animals that retain adequate habitat can maintain larger populations, which means they're more resistant to hunting off. The balance is different. The likelihood that woolly mammoths are still roaming the Eurasian interior in this timeline, that North American horses and ground sloths never vanish, that the megafauna of the Pleistocene persist as a living part of the world's ecosystems rather than fossil bones, that likelihood is meaningfully higher. Not certain, but plausible in a way it simply wasn't once warming began. For the human societies living within this world, those animals are everything. The foraging cultures of the permanently glaciated planet are built around large herds in the same intimate, dependent way that our own agricultural civilizations are built around wheat and rice. Mobility is the first and most essential strategy. You don't try to grow food in a landscape governed by cold and seasonal extremes, you follow it. The great migratory cycles of reindeer, bison, and horses dictate the human calendar more completely than any religious festival or agricultural planting schedule. Groups move with the herds across hundreds of kilometers annually, their social organization calibrated to the demands of that movement, small enough to travel efficiently, large enough to execute cooperative hunts, flexible enough to merge and split as resources concentrate and disperse. Clothing technology in this world isn't a luxury or a cultural refinement. It's the baseline requirement for existence. The archaeological record of our own Paleolithic already shows remarkable sophistication in tailored garments, needles of bone, evidence of layered, fitted clothing that could trap body heat in ways that simple animal skin cloaks cannot. In a world where these conditions never ease, that expertise continues to develop without interruption, without the relaxation of pressure that warmer climates would bring. The knowledge of how to cure hides, how to sew waterproof seams, how to layer insulation effectively, how to produce garments that allow vigorous movement without overheating and still protect during rest. This knowledge becomes among the most valued and carefully transmitted in the entire cultural repertoire. Specialists in it hold real social power. Fire management operates similarly. In our timeline, fire is universal among humans, but its role changes as climate warms and fuel sources shift. In a cold world, the ability to find fuel, dried dung, bone fat, wind-stripped wood from tundra-edge environments, and to maintain fire through weather that actively tries to extinguish it, it is a life-or-death competency. Storage extends this logic into time rather than space. The cold itself becomes a technology. Permafrost is, among other things, a natural freezer, and cultures living above it learn to use it deliberately, caching meat against the lean months of late winter when herds have dispersed and hunting is difficult. The ability to plan months ahead, to accumulate a surplus in times of plenty and draw on it during scarcity, represents a form of economic sophistication that is sometimes underappreciated in foraging societies, but would be absolutely central here. Social cooperation binds all of these strategies together. The groups that survive in marginal cold environments aren't necessarily the ones with the best individual hunters or the cleverest toolmakers. They're the ones with the most robust networks of reciprocal obligation, the ones who share meat from a successful hunt, who contribute to collective drives that no individual could organize alone, who maintain relationships with neighboring groups across large territories, so that when local conditions fail catastrophically, there is somewhere to go and someone obligated to receive you. This is the social technology of survival, and it's perhaps the most sophisticated product of the permanently glaciated world. There's a tendency in later historical thinking to imagine that foraging societies were somehow more fragile than the agricultural and urban ones that followed. That civilization represented an improvement in human resilience as much as complexity. But the relationship is more interesting than that. The foraging cultures of the cold steppe are extraordinarily difficult to destroy by any single failure. They carry their knowledge in their bodies and their social relationships rather than in stored grain that can burn or infrastructure that can collapse. A farming village hit by drought faces potential extinction. A mobile hunting band hit by a poor season disperses, seeks alliance networks, and adapts. The redundancy built into a nomadic, relationship-centered subsistence strategy offers a kind of resilience that large, dense, specialized societies genuinely cannot match. And in a world defined by cold, unpredictability, and the constant pressure of an unforgiving climate, that resilience isn't just an abstract virtue. It's the reason humanity survives at all. But resilience has a cost, and that cost is density. Mobile foraging strategies support relatively small populations spread across large territories, and while that's not a weakness in a world built around cold and seasonal movement, it does raise a fundamental question about what comes next. In our own timeline, the transition to agriculture was the hinge on which everything else turned, the moment that allowed populations to concentrate, specialization to emerge, and the long cascade of cities and writing and states to begin. So what happens to that transition in a world where the ice never retreats? Does agriculture happen at all? And if it does it look anything like what we know? The honest answer is that the conditions that produced agriculture in our timeline were almost suspiciously specific. The Fertile Crescent of the Levant and Mesopotamia offered a combination of wild cereal grasses, the ancestors of wheat and barley, that happened to be large-seeded, self-pollinating, and genetically predisposed to the kinds of mutations that made harvesting and replanting productive. The climate at the end of the Pleistocene was also shifting in ways that created pressure. The Younger Dryas cooling event, a brief return to near-glacial conditions roughly 12,000 years ago, may have pushed some populations in the Levant toward more intensive management of wild plant resources before the subsequent warming made full domestication viable and rewarding. It was a narrow window shaped by very particular ecological and climatic circumstances, and it's far from obvious that equivalent windows exist in every scenario. In a world of permanent glaciation, those windows may never open in the same form. The wild cereals that gave the Fertile Crescent its agricultural advantage require specific temperature and rainfall regimes that a colder, drier world might simply not produce in the same zones or with the same productivity. Precipitation patterns shift dramatically when the ice sheets remain. The Mediterranean basin and the Middle East, in a glacial maximum world, are not lush and well watered. They're considerably drier, their productive zones compressed and altered. The very plants that made the agricultural revolution possible in our history might be marginal, sparse, or differently distributed in this one. That doesn't mean agriculture never emerges. It probably means it emerges later, in fewer places, from different starting materials, and spreads much more slowly. The refugia, where conditions are mild enough to support both population density and plant productivity, are fewer, smaller, and more isolated from each other. An agricultural transition happening in one of those refugia perhaps in sheltered valleys, along certain river systems with year-round water, or in the tropics where cold is less of a defining constraint, would face a much harder time spreading outward than it did in our timeline's warm Holocene. The gradient between the productive refugium and the surrounding landscape is steeper. The incentive to adopt agricultural strategies diminishes rapidly once you move away from the specific conditions that make them viable. Consider which plants are even candidates for domestication. Much of what drives early agriculture is the presence of wild ancestors with the right characteristics: large seeds, manageable growth cycles, tolerance for human disturbance of soil. In colder conditions, root vegetables and cold-hardy grains become more prominent candidates than the sun-loving cereals that dominated the Near Eastern Neolithic. Certain tubers store energy efficiently and can be cultivated with relatively simple techniques in cool climates. Rye, which is more cold-tolerant than wheat or barley, might achieve early agricultural importance in northern refugia in ways it didn't in our warmer Holocene. The entire palette of early agriculture shifts when the temperatures governing what grows where are fundamentally lower. Animal domestication is a different but equally interesting puzzle. In a world where megafauna survive and mobile herding cultures are deeply established, the relationship between humans and large animals is already intensely managed, even if not fully domesticated in the technical sense. There's a spectrum between wild prey, followed herd, selectively culled herd, and fully domesticated livestock, and the permanently glaciated world likely sees many societies operating somewhere in the middle of that range for an extended period. Reindeer herding, for instance, represents a form of semi-domestication that sits between pure foraging and full pastoral management, and in our timeline it emerged relatively late and in specific Arctic-adjacent contexts. In this frozen world, analogous relationships with cold-adapted herd animals might develop much earlier and become far more widespread, potentially forming the backbone of a pastoral economy that substitutes for the agricultural one our history produced. The dog offers a telling example of how domestication might proceed under different pressures. Dogs were domesticated from wolves, almost certainly in a cold steppe foraging context, likely quite early in the Paleolithic, and the reasons were pragmatic: hunting assistance, camp protection, possibly load-bearing in winter travel. In the permanently glaciated world, the incentives for that kind of working relationship with animals, relationships of mutual utility rather than the full ownership model implied by livestock agriculture, are strong and pervasive. Horses might be managed similarly, neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, used for transport and hunting assistance before anyone thinks to breed them for agricultural traction, because agricultural traction doesn't yet exist as a concept. What this suggests is that the permanently glaciated world probably produces, for a very long time, what economists and archaeologists sometimes call mixed economies, societies that combine selective foraging with limited cultivation, mobile pastoralism with seasonal settlement, careful storage with continued hunting. These aren't failed attempts at agriculture. They're sophisticated and successful adaptations to conditions where no single subsistence strategy is optimal, and flexibility provides better long-term survival than specialization. The Mesolithic cultures of our own timeline, the period between the end of the Ice Age and the full agricultural revolution, show this kind of mixed complexity, and they've sometimes been underestimated precisely because they didn't lead toward the trajectory we've come to regard as normal. In a frozen world, the Mesolithic, or its equivalent, might not be a transitional phase at all. It might be a permanent mode. Agriculture, when it does emerge, likely radiates outward from isolated refugia rather than spreading in the broad, rapid wave that characterized the Neolithic expansion in our Holocene world. Distance matters more when the landscape between productive zones is harsh and unforgiving. Groups adopting limited cultivation in a sheltered valley may do so without neighbours close enough or connected enough to replicate or extend the practice for generations. The result is a patchwork, islands of intensified food production surrounded by vast territories of mobile mixed economy, rather than the relatively coherent spread of farming across continents that our timeline eventually produced. That patchwork has profound consequences for everything that follows. Population density in agricultural zones might eventually approach the levels needed to generate complexity, specialists, leadership structures, accumulated surplus, the early preconditions of urban life. But it does so more slowly, in more isolated pockets, and with the constant pressure of that surrounding mobile world pressing in from the edges. The dynamic between the farming settlement and the nomadic herd-following culture doesn't resolve in favour of the farmer as decisively or as quickly as it did in our history. The ice keeps the balance in play longer, and that tension, that unresolved competition between two ways of living in a cold world, shapes the first experiments in something that might cautiously be called civilization, in ways our own history never quite had to reckon with. So let's say the agricultural experiments do take hold, however slowly, however patchily. A valley community learns to store enough surplus to carry it through winter. A coastal group develops reliable enough fishing and sealing to stop moving for a few seasons at a time. A highland basin supports just enough intensive tuber cultivation to anchor a small population in one place, year after year. These are the seeds of something, not yet a town, not yet a city, but a persistent settlement, a place that gets rebuilt and remembered and defended. In our timeline, those seeds grew into Jericho and Çatalhöyük and eventually Uruk. In a permanently glaciated world, the seeds are there, but the soil is different, and what grows from them is going to look strange by our standards. The fundamental prerequisite for any permanent settlement is surplus. More food than you need today, stored against the time when you can't produce more. In warm agricultural societies, that surplus comes primarily from grain, dense, calorie-rich, relatively easy to store, resistant to rot in dry conditions. Grain made the ancient Near Eastern city possible because a good harvest could be taxed, redistributed, traded and warehoused. In the cold world, the storage equation is different in important ways. Frozen ground can actually be an asset. Natural refrigeration that preserves meat, fish and root vegetables in ways warm climates can't manage. Permafrost regions might develop surprisingly effective food storage before they develop anything resembling urban sophistication, because the ground itself is doing work that granaries do in the Fertile Crescent. But cold cuts both ways. Building permanent structures in frozen or near-frozen ground is technically demanding in ways that early societies would have to solve incrementally. Permafrost heaves foundations. Frost penetrates poorly insulated walls. Heating a structure through a 6-month winter requires enormous fuel consumption, wood, bone oil, peat, whatever the local landscape provides. A settlement that can't guarantee its fuel supply through the coldest months is a settlement that either disperses or dies, and that constraint shapes where towns can even begin to exist. You don't build a permanent community somewhere because it's strategically interesting or symbolically meaningful. You build it where winter can actually be survived in place, and that's a much narrower list of locations. Sanitation compounds the problem. Mobile populations spread their waste across landscapes large enough to absorb it safely. A concentrated settlement produces concentrated waste, and in a cold, slow decomposition environment, that waste doesn't break down the way it does in the tropics or in temperate warm conditions. Disease vectors that tend to emerge in early urban populations, enteric illnesses, respiratory infections amplified by close quarters, and shared air in sealed winter spaces would likely check population growth sharply. The communities that survive long enough to grow are probably those that develop effective waste disposal and ventilation strategies early, whether through deliberate planning or painful trial and error. That's a high bar for what are still fundamentally small, low-technology communities. Early towns in this world probably fail more often and more catastrophically than early towns in ours. Year-round provisioning is perhaps the deepest structural problem. A town of even a few hundred people requires continuous supply, not just during harvest or hunting season, but through the gap months when nothing grows and travel is dangerous. In warm agricultural regions, that problem was partially solved by the diversity of the annual calendar, planting here, harvesting there, trade with neighbours filling the gaps. In a cold world with a shorter productive season and more severe winters, the gap months are longer, and the penalties for running short are absolute. Starvation doesn't give you a second chance. Every early settlement in this scenario is essentially making a bet that it can stockpile enough, maintain its stores against spoilage and theft, and keep its population fed through conditions that in bad years might last months longer than expected. Many of those bets would fail. Given all of this, where would the first real towns appear? Almost certainly in the most climatically sheltered zones available, the southern refugia, sheltered interior basins, and perhaps certain coastal environments where the ocean moderates temperature extremes. The Mediterranean coastline, though drier and cooler in this scenario than in our timeline, still represents one of the milder zones available in Eurasia. River valleys cutting through interior plateaus might offer protected microclimates where wind is reduced and drainage is reliable. In the Americas, the lower latitudes of Mesoamerica and the Andean highlands, already productive refugia in our analysis, become prime candidates, as do coastal regions of what would be our Pacific coast. In East Asia, sheltered valleys in what is now southern China or the Korean peninsula might support early proto-urban clustering. What's notable is how far south this pushes the centres of early civilization compared to our own history. Mesopotamia, which gave us Sumer and the earliest cities we know of, sits at roughly 30 to 35 degrees north latitude. In a glacial maximum world, that latitude is probably too dry and too stressed to anchor dense settlement. The action shifts further south, further toward the tropics, where cold is less brutal and growing seasons, though compressed by altitude or seasonal variation, remain viable. This isn't a minor adjustment. It means that the geography of early civilization in this frozen world may bear almost no resemblance to the geography of early civilization in ours. Different rivers, different coastlines, different mountain ranges become the structural backbones of emerging complexity. Urbanization, when it finally does begin, is likely smaller in scale for longer. The demographic logic that drives cities is fundamentally tied to surplus depth. How much excess can a productive zone generate beyond immediate subsistence needs? In warm agricultural societies, that surplus can be very large in good years, large enough to feed specialized populations of craftspeople, administrators, priests, and soldiers who produce no food themselves. In colder, less predictable agricultural systems, the surplus is thinner, less reliable, and more vulnerable to bad seasons. The city that emerges under these conditions is more cautious in its ambitions. It probably never fully detaches from its food-producing hinterland. The division between farmer and urbanite stays blurry longer, because the margins are too tight to allow many people to step entirely out of food production. There's something worth sitting with in that image, a world where the first towns are smaller, harder won, more precarious, built in different places by people who have already demonstrated extraordinary resilience just by getting there. They don't spring up in the aftermath of a warming world that made everything suddenly easier. They are built in spite of conditions that never relented, by communities that figured out, through generations of accumulated knowledge, how to tip the balance just barely enough toward permanence. That's not a lesser achievement than what happened in our history. In some ways it's a more impressive one. But it does mean that the path from first settlement to anything resembling a city is longer, slower, and more uncertain, and that what eventually emerges, if it does, will carry the marks of cold and scarcity and hard-won stability in ways that our own early civilizations simply never had to. Those smaller, harder-won towns we just described don't exist in isolation. Even in a glacially constrained world, communities trade, compete, ally, and occasionally conquer each other. The question isn't whether political complexity eventually emerges. Human societies reliably move toward hierarchy and territorial organization, when conditions allow, but what shape that complexity takes when the physical landscape is so fundamentally different from the one that shaped our history. And in a world still gripped by permanent ice, the landscape isn't just different in degree, it's different in kind, and the geography of power rearranges itself accordingly. Start with the basic mechanics of territorial control. Empires, in our history, tend to grow by projecting force across continuous terrain, following rivers, crossing plains, moving along coastlines where logistics are manageable and communication is fast enough to hold an extended polity together. The Roman Empire followed the Mediterranean. The Mongols swept across the Eurasian steppe. The great river civilizations of the ancient world organized themselves around the arteries that allowed movement, trade, and the rapid deployment of military force. In a glacial maximum world, many of those natural corridors are blocked, transformed, or simply gone. The Eurasian steppe, which in our world acts as a vast highway connecting east and west, is in a glacial scenario colder, drier, and substantially less productive, a zone that may support only sparse populations and cannot easily sustain the logistical chains that imperial expansion requires. The great rivers of the northern interior either don't exist in their familiar forms, or drain landscapes too, frozen and unproductive to anchor the agricultural tax base that empires need to function. What replaces them? Glacial barriers create their own choke points, and choke points generate power. Any pass through an ice sheet, any navigable gap between mountain glaciers, any river corridor threading through otherwise impassable frozen terrain becomes enormously valuable, not just as a trade route, but as a strategic prize worth holding and taxing. Think of how mountain passes functioned in our history. The Khyber Pass, the Alpine crossings, the Bosphorus. These narrow corridors translated into political power for whoever controlled them, because everyone who needed to move through the region had no alternative. In a glaciated world, those dynamics intensify. There are more barriers, which means fewer viable routes, which means the communities positioned astride those routes accumulate leverage that is difficult to contest. This has an important implication for the kind of political entities that might emerge. Large territorial empires are genuinely harder to sustain in this environment. An empire's coherence depends on its ability to extract surplus from productive land, move armies across its territory, and maintain communication networks fast enough to respond to rebellion and invasion. In a cold world where agricultural productivity is patchy, where winter makes large portions of any given territory inaccessible for months at a time, and where the energy cost of movement across frozen or mountainous terrain is punishing, the logic of vast territorial control breaks down. What works better, arguably, is something more like a network of fortified nodes, settlements controlling critical corridors, connected by seasonal routes, operating through alliance and commercial interdependence rather than direct administrative domination. Less Rome, more Venice. Less Achaemenid Persia, more a web of trading cities that share interests without sharing a sovereign. Trade networks in this world are shaped by two intersecting realities: the scarcity of certain essential goods and the difficulty of moving anything in winter. Hardy overland routes following river valleys and mountain corridors carry goods during the warmer months, when frozen ground thaws enough to allow pack animals or sledged transport, and when passes are briefly clear. Those same routes shut down or become genuinely dangerous as the cold returns. This seasonality probably drives a rhythm of intense commercial activity during a compressed trading season, gathering fairs, market convocations, seasonal ports, followed by months of local insularity. It's not unlike the rhythms of medieval European trade before reliable year-round infrastructure, but more extreme and more structurally embedded. Communities plan around the trading season the way they plan around the harvest, because both are existential. The seas play a complicated role. We established earlier that sea levels are dramatically lower in a glacially extended world, and exposed continental shelves create new coastal geographies that are difficult to map precisely without knowing which specific configuration we're imagining. But certain principles hold. Coastal communities in temperate latitudes have access to marine protein resources that partially insulate them from agricultural volatility, and coastal trade, even in cold, seasonally ice-affected waters, tends to be more efficient than overland trade over long distances. Wherever the ice-free seasonal seas allow passage, maritime networks likely develop early and become strategically important. The communities positioned at the intersections of coastal routes and interior corridors, the natural harbours where overland paths meet navigable water, are the communities that accumulate wealth, population, and eventually political authority. So which regions might emerge as long-term centres of power in this scenario? The southern refugia that allowed early settlement to consolidate, the Mediterranean fringe, the lower Mesoamerican highlands, coastal East Asia, parts of sub-Saharan Africa are the obvious candidates for the first phases of political complexity. But as time progresses and populations grow, the frontier zones take on new importance. Resource frontiers in a cold world have a specific character. They're often rich in exactly the things that settled agricultural communities lack: furs, preserved protein, certain minerals, timber from the boreal margins, and the groups that can navigate between the resource frontier and the settled core become indispensable intermediaries. Think of the role that northern forest peoples played in our history as suppliers of furs and amber to Mediterranean and Near Eastern markets. That dynamic likely intensifies in a colder world where thermal insulation and preserved food are not luxury goods, but survival necessities. The political centres that prove most durable are probably those that combine three advantages: access to a sheltered and productive agricultural or maritime hinterland, control of at least one critical trade corridor, and the ability to manage relationships with resource frontier peoples without being destabilized by them. That combination is rarer than it might seem, and it suggests that real power in this world is more fragmented and more contested than in our history. The great universal empires, the ones that span continents and impose a single administrative culture across millions of people, may never quite materialize, because the physical geography never allows the kind of logistical dominance that makes them possible. What you get instead might be persistent regional powers, each dominant within its own glacially defined basin, each deeply aware of its neighbours across the passes, each developing political cultures shaped by the constant negotiation between what the cold permits and what ambition demands. There's something almost familiar in that image, even if the specific geography is alien. Human power has always organized itself around what the land makes possible and what it withholds. In a world the ice never released, the land simply withholds more often, more severely, more completely. The empires that form under those conditions are smaller, tougher, and built with the knowledge that the cold is a permanent partner in every political calculation, never a problem to be solved, only a constraint to be navigated, season after season, for as long as civilization endures. Politics organizes how people survive together. But there's a deeper layer beneath every political arrangement, beneath every trading network and fortified choke point. And that layer is the story a community tells itself about why the world is the way it is, in a world where the ice never retreated. The cold isn't a historical memory or a distant scientific fact, it's the permanent, inescapable texture of existence. And when something is that omnipresent, that powerful and that indifferent to human suffering, it almost always becomes sacred. Think about the cosmologies that have emerged from the coldest environments humans actually inhabited. The Norse mythological tradition imagines the world itself born from the collision of fire and ice, two primal forces locked in eternal opposition, with everything livable carved out of that tension. The world doesn't begin in warmth and abundance, it begins in struggle. Creation is not a gift, but a hard-won temporary condition, perpetually under threat from the frost giants, at the margins of existence. That mythology came from a culture living at the northern edge of what agriculture could sustain, where winter genuinely threatened survival and the return of spring was never entirely certain. Now imagine that same psychological orientation, but without the spring, without the annual reassurance that the cold relents, that the sun returns strong enough to matter, that the harvest will come. What does cosmology look like when the fundamental reassurance is never delivered? Almost certainly, the religious imagination of a permanently glaciated world would organize itself around a different relationship to light and darkness. In our history, many of the oldest ritual traditions center on the solstices, the dying and returning sun, the fear that the days might keep shortening and the light never come back. Stonehenge aligns with the winter solstice. Newgrange in Ireland is built so that a single shaft of sunlight penetrates its inner chamber on the shortest day of the year. These monuments suggest a profound anxiety about solar return, an anxiety that ritual was designed to manage. In a colder world, that anxiety has more justification. The sun does return, but it never returns with enough force to break the grip of the ice. The growing season remains compressed and unreliable. The fear encoded in solstice ritual isn't periodically dissolved by a warm, productive summer. It's confirmed, year after year, as a permanent feature of existence. This likely produces religious traditions that are less oriented toward cyclical renewal and more oriented toward endurance. The sacred figure isn't the dying and reborn god of fertility cults. It's the ancestor who survived the last terrible winter, the spirit that guided the migration through the pass, the guardian who knows where food can be found when the herds have moved and the stores are empty. Ancestral religion has always been prominent in cold-adapted cultures, and that emphasis makes deep sense. In an environment where survival knowledge is genuinely rare and irreplaceable, the elders who carry it become figures of almost supernatural authority. And when they die, their knowledge doesn't disappear, it transforms into wisdom that must be ritually preserved and consulted. The dead don't depart, they become advisors. The boundary between the living community and the community of ancestors stays porous, because the community needs it to. Migration itself becomes mythologized in ways that would seem strange to settled agricultural peoples. In our history, many origin myths describe a founding migration, a wandering through the wilderness before arriving at the promised land. But those myths are told from the perspective of people who have settled, who have arrived, for whom migration is memory rather than present reality. In a glacial world where significant portions of the population remain semi-mobile, or where communities periodically relocate in response to shifting ice margins and failing resources, migration isn't background, it's ongoing experience. The sacred journey isn't something that happened to the ancestors, it's something that might happen again, might already be happening, might be required of this generation before the next winter closes the passes. That changes the emotional character of those stories entirely. They're not nostalgic, they're instructional. They encode route knowledge, seasonal timing, the locations of water sources, the signs that a particular valley is about to become uninhabitable. Myth functions as a survival manual dressed in sacred language. Extreme environments also have a well-documented tendency to intensify communal identity and sharpen the boundaries between in-group and out-group. When resources are genuinely scarce and survival depends on cooperation, the community's ability to enforce sharing norms, punish defection, and maintain trust across seasons becomes existential. Taboos emerge around hoarding, waste, and disloyalty, not as arbitrary prohibitions, but as survival-critical regulations that religion sanctifies so they don't require constant renegotiation. The person who hoards food during a famine isn't just antisocial, they're impious. The hunter who keeps more than their share isn't greedy, they're cursed. Sacred law and practical necessity fuse together, because communities that fail to fuse them don't survive long enough to pass on their traditions. Social hierarchy in cold-adapted societies tends to concentrate around specific forms of expertise. The hunter whose knowledge of animal behavior is unmatched, the elder whose memory of past winters contains life-saving pattern recognition, the shaman or ritual specialist who manages the community's relationship with the forces that control weather and game. These hierarchies are often less about accumulated wealth and more about irreplaceable knowledge, because in an environment where material surplus is hard to maintain, knowledge is the most durable form of capital. That kind of hierarchy carries its own religious logic. The people at the top of it are there because they understand things others don't, and the things they understand are sacred in nature. The showman who knows why the herd moved and how to call it back isn't performing a purely practical function. They're mediating between the human community and a world that is fundamentally mysterious and often hostile. There's something worth dwelling on here, which is that climate doesn't just shape economies and bodies and borders. It shapes the categories through which people understand causation, justice, and meaning. In a world where cold kills and warmth saves, where a late freeze can undo a season's work, where survival is genuinely contingent on forces beyond human control, the theological instinct to propitiate rather than to conquer makes profound sense. You don't domesticate winter the way you domesticate a river with irrigation canals. You negotiate with it, honor it, try to understand its patterns, and maintain the humility of someone who knows the cold could kill you before morning if you misread the signs. That's a different psychological posture than the one that tends to dominate in warmer, more agriculturally abundant civilizations. The posture of mastery, of nature as resource, of the future as something to be engineered rather than endured. A glacially permanent world might produce cultures that are, by deep temperament, more oriented toward adaptation than toward control. Not passive, the sheer ingenuity required to survive in cold environments argues powerfully against passivity, but realistic, in a bone-level way, about what the world owes humanity, which is nothing, and what humanity owes the world in return for being allowed to persist within it is attention, respect, and the willingness to move when the ice says it's time. That orientation toward adaptation rather than mastery doesn't stay philosophical for long. It gets built into things, into the stitching of a garment, the angle of a roof, the composition of an alloy, the design of a runner on a sledge. Cold is one of the most merciless engineering teachers that exists. It exposes every weakness in every system with remorseless efficiency. Materials fail at low temperatures in ways they never do in warmth. Bodies lose heat faster than they generate it if clothing is poorly designed. Settlements that ignore thermal dynamics don't produce discomfort, they produce corpses. In a world where the ice never retreated, this pressure would be applied continuously across millennia to every domain of human ingenuity. The question isn't whether that produces technological innovation. It clearly does. The question is what kind, how fast, and whether the shape of progress would be recognizable to us. Start with the most immediate problem, keeping a human body alive in sustained cold. Textile technology in our world's coldest adapted cultures reached extraordinary levels of sophistication long before industrialization. Layered insulation systems, moisture-wicking base layers made from specific animal fibers, waterproofing techniques derived from gut and skin, tailored cuts that minimized heat loss at the wrists and neck. Arctic peoples independently developed designs that modern outdoor gear engineers have essentially rediscovered and replicated using synthetic materials. In a permanently glaciated world, this engineering tradition wouldn't be a regional specialty practiced by cultures at the fringes of a warmer global norm. It would be a universal core technology, foundational as agriculture was in our world. Every community would be in the business of solving the insulation problem, and they would have thousands of years to refine their solutions. The diversity and sophistication of cold weather clothing in such a world might genuinely exceed anything we've produced, because the selection pressure never relented and the stakes never dropped. Shelter architecture would develop along a similarly intensive trajectory. The physics of heat retention in a structure are not simple. Thermal mass, insulation value, ventilation to warmth trade-offs, the problem of moisture accumulation in sealed spaces the engineering of hearths and heating systems that don't poison their inhabitants with carbon monoxide while keeping them from freezing. In our world, these problems were solved piecemeal in specific cold climate regions, while the majority of civilization developed in temperate and warm zones where the engineering priorities were different. In a glacial world, every major settled population would be wrestling with these problems simultaneously, which likely accelerates the development of sophisticated heating architecture considerably. Whether that takes the form of hypercaust-style underfloor heating, elaborate chimney systems, communal heat-sharing designs where multiple families cluster around a central thermal core, or some combination of all of these is hard to say with certainty, but the incentive to solve these problems early would be overwhelming. Transport technology is where the glacial world might produce its most distinctive divergences from our own developmental history. In our world, the wheel became foundational to land transport relatively early, but wheels are not particularly useful on snow and ice. What works on frozen terrain is the runner. Sledge technology in cold-adapted cultures reached a high degree of refinement, with different runner materials suited to different snow conditions, weight distribution optimized for specific loads, and animal harness systems developed for dogs, reindeer, and horses pulling across ice rather than through mud. In a world where significant portions of the inhabitable landscape are either frozen or prone to heavy seasonal snowfall for much of the year, sledge technology might develop the kind of engineering investment and cultural prestige that wheeled vehicles accumulated in our own history. Skiing, snowshoeing, and ice travel more broadly would be serious engineering domains, not niche recreational practices. The infrastructure of movement would be fundamentally different, optimized for surfaces that in our world are considered obstacles. Animal power in a cold world would also develop in a different configuration. The species most useful to human transport in warm climates, horses pulling wheeled vehicles on maintained roads, oxen working tilled fields, remain relevant in cold climates, but are joined or in some contexts replaced by animals better suited to extreme cold and rough terrain. Reindeer herding cultures in our world developed extraordinarily intricate relationships with their animals, with the reindeer serving simultaneously as transport, food source, textile source, and navigational partner. In a world where the cold never retreated, this kind of intensive, multifunction animal relationship might become a civilizational norm rather than a regional adaptation, potentially delaying or redirecting the development of purely mechanical solutions to transport problems. Metallurgy and materials science present more complicated questions. Cold environments create demand for metals with specific properties, toughness at low temperatures, resistance to brittle fracture, high thermal conductivity for heating applications. Whether those demands accelerate metallurgical innovation or constrain it depends heavily on where metal deposits are accessible and how the economics of fuel-intensive smelting work in a world where fuel is a survival resource first and an industrial input second. Forests in a glacial world are less extensive, more concentrated, and more fiercely competed over, not just for building material and fuel, but because woodland provides critical windbreaks, hunting habitat, and foraging resources. The energy economics of early metallurgy might look quite different when every cord of wood burned in a smelter is wood that isn't heating a family through February. That doesn't necessarily mean slower metallurgical development, but it might mean different prioritization, metals that improve heating efficiency, that extend the lifespan of critical transport equipment, that make better needles and awls for working thick hides, might receive intensive development attention before metals that serve agricultural or military applications. Food preservation technology is one area where cold climates have an obvious and powerful natural advantage. Freezing is extraordinarily effective at preventing spoilage, and a world of permanent cold provides essentially free industrial-scale refrigeration across vast territories. This might actually accelerate the development of preserved food economies, long-distance food trade, and surplus storage systems that in warmer climates required far more complex technological solutions. The ability to reliably preserve meat, fish, and fat across seasons. Not as a seasonal bonus, but as a permanent environmental feature, changes the economics of food security in ways that could support larger populations than the agricultural output of a cold climate might otherwise suggest. Taken together, this profile of technological development suggests something that isn't simply faster or slower than our own history, but organized around a genuinely different hierarchy of problems. Heating before metallurgy, insulation before architecture, transport efficiency before military engineering, preservation before agriculture. Whether that alternate sequence of priorities produces a civilization recognizably advanced by our standards, or one that is sophisticated and functional in ways we might struggle to categorize, is itself an open question. Progress doesn't stop in the cold. If anything, the cold ensures it can't afford to. But it flows toward different problems first, and the technologies that become foundational shape every subsequent layer of civilization built on top of them. A world under permanent glacial pressure wouldn't produce lesser technology. It would produce other technology, aimed with brilliant precision at the particular ways the cold tries to kill you. The same relentless pressure that reshapes technology on land doesn't stop at the shoreline. In a world where the ice never retreated, the ocean becomes a fundamentally different arena, sometimes more hostile, sometimes more inviting, but always operating by rules that would redirect the entire trajectory of maritime history in ways our own maps of discovery can barely suggest. Start with what the oceans actually look like. Sea levels in a world of permanent glaciation would be dramatically lower, potentially by 100 meters or more, depending on how much ice volume remains locked in continental sheets. That single fact rewrites the coastlines of every continent. The shallow continental shelves that today lie submerged, the North Sea basin, the Sunda Shelf connecting much of Southeast Asia, the Bering Land Bridge, vast stretches of what is now the Gulf of Mexico's shallower regions would be exposed land. The world is physically larger in terms of accessible terrain. Coastlines would be pushed far out from where we find them today, and the shallow water routes that ancient mariners in our world used to navigate carefully would simply not exist in the same form. Navigation that once threaded through sheltered coastal shallows would instead have to contend with open water approaches to coastlines that now sit far back from the new shoreline. This cuts both ways for exploration. On one hand, the exposed shelves create vast new territories accessible entirely overland or by coastal walking. Human expansion in this world doesn't require boats to accomplish what in our timeline demanded seafaring skill. The peopling of continents that in our history required water crossings, even short ones, becomes achievable on foot, which potentially accelerates the spread of human populations into territories that in our world were reached only with considerable navigational effort. In that sense, the age of overland exploration would be richer, longer, and more consequential than in our own timeline. Cultures might develop extraordinary expertise in reading ice, wind, and terrain across distances that have no analogue in warmer world geography. The overland explorer in a glacial world is navigating a genuinely different planet, one with more surface to cover, more environments to encounter, and fewer water barriers to stop forward movement. But the ice itself complicates the maritime picture severely. Expanded polar sea ice would push seasonal ice limits much further into what we consider temperate waters. The North Atlantic, which in our timeline became one of the most consequential maritime highways in human history, would be encroached upon from the north by sea ice that made seasonal navigation genuinely dangerous across larger portions of the year. The currents that warm and stabilize our North Atlantic, driven in part by the thermohaline circulation that depends on specific temperature gradients, would operate differently in a colder world, possibly weakening the Gulf Stream's moderating effect. Sailing north in the North Atlantic would be more treacherous, the weather more violent, the ice more unpredictable. The route that in our world connected Europe to North America eventually would be harder and more hazardous, not easier. Yet the North Pacific might tell a different story. with land connections between Asia and North America either still intact or only recently submerged depending on the specific glacial conditions. The Pacific Rim becomes an overland and coastal highway, rather than a barrier requiring open ocean crossings. Maritime cultures along that rim might develop impressive coastal navigation skills, while remaining fundamentally oriented toward the shore rather than toward open ocean voyaging. The incentive to strike across thousands of miles of open water diminishes when the coastline runs continuously, and the deep water Pacific crossings that in our world represented astonishing feats of Polynesian navigation might never materialize in the same form, because the geographic logic that pushed people out into the open ocean would be different. In the southern hemisphere, conditions are somewhat different again. The southern oceans are already among the most ferocious on Earth. An expanded glaciation would push Antarctic ice further north, making southern latitudes even more inhospitable to navigation. The routes around the southern capes, Tierra del Fuego, the Cape of Good Hope, would be surrounded by ice and violent cold that would make them functionally impassable for any technology short of modern ice-breaking capability. This has enormous implications for any civilization that in our world used southern routes to connect ocean basins. In a glacial world, the southern passage between oceans effectively closes, which concentrates all interocean movement through narrower equatorial routes, where the ice never reaches. The equatorial oceans, notably, remain accessible. The tropics in a glacial world are cooler than today, perhaps significantly so, but they are not frozen. Equatorial maritime civilizations would still have viable sea lanes, and the cultures that inhabit tropical coastlines would have a navigational advantage in some respects over their cold climate counterparts. The Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, portions of the equatorial Pacific, these would remain navigable, perhaps with somewhat more aggressive weather patterns driven by altered temperature differentials, but not closed. It's entirely plausible that in a world of permanent glaciation, the dominant maritime civilizations emerge not from the temperate zones that produced our most famous age of sail, but from equatorial cultures who have continuous access to open water, while their higher latitude rivals are periodically or permanently hemmed in by ice. This shifts the geography of discovery in a profound way. In our history, the age of exploration was largely driven by temperate and cold latitude civilizations, European powers seeking routes to Asian markets, pushing south along African coasts, eventually crossing the Atlantic. That story is built on specific geographic conditions, open North Atlantic waters, accessible African coasts not blocked by ice, and the existential pressure of competing overland Silk Road routes. In a glacial world, the European analog civilization, if it exists at all in recognizable form, faces northern routes that are far more constrained by ice, and southern routes to warmer waters that require navigating through unfamiliar and hostile cold water environments before reaching anything usable. The incentive structure for long-distance maritime exploration from cold latitude civilizations is different, not absent, but reorganized around different bottlenecks. What might emerge instead is a world where the great age of maritime discovery comes from the other direction, from equatorial civilizations expanding outward into accessible waters, or from the gradual coastal creep of cold-adapted cultures learning to work seasonal ice in the same way that in our world, sailors learned to work seasonal monsoons. The technology of ice navigation, reading pack ice, exploiting leads, timing passages through seasonally clearing channels, could become the glacial world's equivalent of our own celestial navigation tradition, a sophisticated body of knowledge that confers enormous advantage on those who master it. The map of discovery in this world isn't simply a colder version of our own. It's organized around a completely different set of passable routes, blocked passages, exposed coasts, and geographic incentives. Some of the great voyages that defined our age of exploration simply wouldn't happen because the routes don't exist or the motivation doesn't align. But others, stranger, colder, and crossing terrain, that in our world lies underwater, might exceed anything our own explorers ever achieved. Where exploration runs into its limits, industry picks up the challenge. And in a world where the ice never retreated, industry would face a pressure that our own industrial revolution only dimly experienced. Not the pressure of profit margins or competitive markets, but the raw biological urgency of staying warm enough to survive the winter. That changes everything about what industrialization looks like, what drives it, and where it concentrates. Think about what cold actually demands from a civilization. Shelter becomes an engineering problem rather than a convenience. Food storage and preservation are existential priorities rather than logistical afterthoughts. Transportation through ice and snow requires technology that in our world only appeared in specific Arctic-adjacent cultures. And heat, constant, reliable, controllable heat, becomes the organizing principle around which almost everything else is arranged. In our own industrial revolution, the steam engine emerged from the desire to pump water out of coal mines and eventually to move goods more efficiently. In a glacially pressured world, the same basic thermodynamic principles might be discovered earlier, or at least developed with far greater urgency, because heating your city through a 9-month winter is a far more immediate crisis than pumping out a mine shaft. The fuel question becomes absolutely central in a way it never quite was in our warmer timeline. The first and most obvious resource under pressure would be wood. Forests in a glacial world are already reduced, pushed south by ice sheets, concentrated in refugia that don't extend endlessly in every direction. A civilization that depends on timber for heat, for construction, for ships, and for charcoal-fired metalworking would run into deforestation crises faster and more severely than our own cultures did. This isn't speculation. Even in medieval Europe, wood shortages were a genuine constraint on urban growth. In a colder, more forested but smaller world, that ceiling arrives much sooner. The transition to coal or peat or other combustible alternatives would likely be accelerated not by industrial ingenuity, but by simple scarcity. When the forests thin out and winter is still 6 months long, you burn what you have. Peat, interestingly, might play a larger role in this alternate industrial history than it did in ours. In a world with more boggy, waterlogged landscapes at the edges of glaciated regions, the kinds of terrain that form naturally where ice sheets drain and permafrost thaws incompletely, peat would be abundant and accessible. Cultures in Ireland, Scotland and Scandinavia burned peat for millennia in our own world, but they did so in contexts where coal eventually superseded it. In a glacial world, peat might be a transitional energy source that fuels the early stages of what eventually becomes a coal-dependent industrial society, buying time while deeper mining technology develops. And coal itself would eventually become indispensable, perhaps more dramatically so than in our timeline. The coal seams that in our world-powered Victorian Britain and Ruhr Valley Germany would be present in the same geological formations, because geology doesn't care about surface climate. But the motivation to extract them, the desperation to find reliable bulk fuel that doesn't require cutting down increasingly distant forests, would be more acute. You can imagine a glacial world equivalent of early industrialists, not chasing profits first, but chasing heat security, the ability to guarantee that a city of 100,000 people can survive the next winter without mass fuel shortages. That's a powerful driver of mining technology, distribution infrastructure, and eventually the mechanization of extraction. Oil, too, would eventually enter the picture, though its path to discovery might differ. In our world, early petroleum use was partly about lighting and lubrication, before it became about combustion and transport. In a cold climate civilization, petroleum's properties as a fuel and as a lubricant for machinery operating in sub-zero temperatures would be particularly valuable. Machinery in extreme cold is notoriously difficult. Metals become brittle, lubricants thicken and fail, moving parts seize. Finding oils and greases that remain fluid at low temperatures would be an engineering priority, and this might push cold climate civilizations toward petroleum chemistry through a different but no less urgent door than the one our industrial chemists walked through. Infrastructure in this world looks fundamentally different at every scale. Roads are harder to maintain through freeze-thaw cycles, through snowfall, through the ground movement that permafrost and frost heave cause. In our world, Roman roads were remarkable engineering achievements in temperate climates. In a glacially pressured civilization, road building requires solving engineering problems that our Romans never faced. Stone paving, drainage, insulation of roadbeds, maintenance through brutal winters. These are non-trivial challenges that demand continuous institutional attention. It's possible that glacial world civilizations invest far more in waterways and river transport during warmer months, precisely because roads are so costly to build and maintain through cold conditions. Canals and river routes that freeze reliably might actually become seasonal highways in their own right. The same river that is a trade route in summer becomes a smooth road for sledge transport in winter, as northern cultures in our own world exploited extensively. The labour question in a cold climate industrial society is deeply constrained by the agricultural calendar. If growing seasons are compressed perhaps 3 to 4 months in the most productive southern refugia, less elsewhere, then the bulk of the population is freed from agricultural labour for a much larger portion of the year than in temperate farming societies. This has a complicated double effect. On one hand, more labour is theoretically available for industrial work, construction and manufacturing during the long cold months. On the other hand, those same cold months make outdoor labour dangerous, slow and costly in terms of calories burned to stay warm. The calculus of labour productivity in cold conditions is genuinely different. Workers need more food to fuel their bodies, need more clothing and shelter to protect them, and can accomplish less per hour in extreme cold than in temperate conditions. An industrial society in this world would likely develop indoor manufacturing to a sophisticated degree much earlier than our own, creating enclosed heated workshops and early factory-like environments, not as a late-stage development of industrial capitalism, but as a basic survival adaptation. All of this points toward a geographic concentration that our own industrial revolution only partly displayed. In our timeline industry spread across much of temperate Europe and North America relatively quickly because the habitable zone was large enough to support multiple competing industrial centers. In a glacially pressured world, the habitable zone is smaller, the strategic locations more limited, and the advantages of being near fuel, navigable water, and defensible shelter more decisive. Industrial civilization might emerge in a smaller number of intensely developed nodes, places where coal or peat is accessible, where rivers remain navigable for enough of the year to move goods, and where the surrounding geography provides some protection from the worst of the cold. Think of something like a handful of heavily engineered river valleys or coastal pockets, each one a hive of industrial activity surrounded by vast, thinly populated cold terrain. That concentration might actually accelerate certain kinds of technological progress, the way that dense, competitive environments tend to generate innovation faster than dispersed ones. But it also creates fragility. A civilization whose industrial capacity is packed into 5 or 6 strategic zones is one where losing any one of those zones to conquest, resource exhaustion, or catastrophic winter could set back the entire project of civilization significantly. The fight against cold in this world is never really won. It's managed season by season, with the understanding that the ice is always there and the margin for error is always thinner than it looks. Pull back from the workshops and coal seams for a moment and try to imagine the political map of this world at something like a modern technological level. Not a world frozen in the Iron Age or even the medieval period, but a world that has somehow reached a rough equivalent of the 21st century aircraft, telecommunications, industrial agriculture, nation-states with defined borders and international institutions. What does that map actually look like? Because the answer is almost certainly unrecognizable to anyone raised on a standard globe. Start with the most obvious displacement. The regions that in our world became the dominant centers of global power. Northern Europe, the northeastern United States, Canada, northern China, Russia, are either buried under kilometers of ice or reduced to marginal, thinly populated frontier zones. Britain under a persistent glacial regime is not the seat of a seafaring empire. It's an ice-scoured peninsula with, at best, a narrow habitable fringe along its southern coast. Russia, which in our world spans 11 time zones and holds enormous strategic depth, is largely a frozen wasteland offering little in the way of agricultural productivity or population density. Northern China and the Korean peninsula, which in our timeline supported some of the densest and most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, would be climatically stressed environments where farming is marginal and population ceilings are low. So where do the powers rise instead? The answer almost certainly lies in the subtropical and tropical refugia that in our hypothetical never-ended ice age would constitute the primary habitable zones of the planet. The Nile Corridor, the Levant, Mesopotamia. These regions supported early civilization in our own timeline, precisely because they were productive and accessible. In a world where Europe is mostly glaciated, these zones don't just matter early, they remain the core of global power indefinitely. A nation controlling the Nile Valley in this alternate present isn't a developing country struggling with colonial legacies. It's potentially one of the most strategically critical states on Earth, sitting atop some of the only reliable agricultural land in the Northern Hemisphere's accessible latitudes. Sub-Saharan Africa, which in our world was systematically exploited and marginalized through colonialism, would occupy a completely different position in this alternate geopolitical order. Much of the African continent would be among the most habitable terrain on the planet. Well above the ice line, with diverse ecologies, river systems, and agricultural potential that in a glacially constrained world would be extraordinarily valuable. The question of who controls and develops those resources and on what terms would be the defining geopolitical contest of this alternate modernity. West Africa's river valleys, the Great Rift Lakes region, the Ethiopian highlands, these become the contested heartlands of major power competition rather than peripheral zones in someone else's story. South and Southeast Asia present a similarly elevated position. The Indian subcontinent, protected from glaciation by the Himalayas and warmed by the surrounding ocean, likely supports some of the largest population centres in this world. Southeast Asia's river deltas and island chains, productive and accessible by sea, probably sustain dense, sophisticated civilizations comparable to anything that rose in temperate Eurasia in our own history. These are not minor players in this alternate present. They are among the most populated, most economically central regions on Earth, and their geopolitical weight would reflect that reality. The Americas tell a different story depending on where you look. Mesoamerica and the Andean zone, which even in our timeline produced the Aztec, Maya, and Inca civilizations, without any contact with the Old World's technological traditions, would be among the most developed and densely populated regions in this Western Hemisphere. The southern cone of South America, Argentina, Chile, southern Brazil, would offer habitable temperate land of enormous value, potentially the equivalent of what North America's breadbasket represented in our world. And exactly because that land is so valuable and so limited, the competition for it would be intense and likely violent, which brings us to the geopolitical logic that would dominate international relations in this alternate present. In our world, conflict and alliance are driven by a complicated mixture of ideology, economic interest, historical grievance, and resource competition. In an Ice Age world, the foundational driver of almost everything is access to habitable land and the food security it represents. Nations that sit on productive agricultural territory would be simultaneously wealthy, powerful, and perpetually threatened by neighbours facing food scarcity. The concept of a climate refugee doesn't appear as an emerging humanitarian concern the way it does in our contemporary debates. It's a permanent, structural feature of human civilization, baked into the geopolitical order from the very beginning. Migration pressure would shape borders in ways that have no real equivalent in our timeline. The edges of the habitable zones, those transitional regions where agriculture becomes marginal and populations struggle, would generate constant movement toward warmer, more productive core territories. Nations in those core territories would face an unending calculus: absorb migrants and gain population and labour, or resist them and maintain internal stability at the cost of humanitarian crisis on the frontier. Border security in this world isn't a political debate about identity and economic competition. It's an existential question about whether a nation can sustain itself against the pressure of millions of people being slowly pushed out of unlivable cold. The transport corridors that connect habitable zones would be extraordinarily strategic. A mountain pass, a navigable river through otherwise impassable terrain, a coastal route linking two productive regions. These become geopolitical prizes worth fighting wars over, not because of ideological rivalry, but because controlling them means controlling the flow of food, fuel, and people. Alliances would form along lines of geographic complementarity. A nation with agricultural surplus, allying with one that controls a key route to market, or two cold-adjacent states banding together to defend access to a shared southern trade partner. The logic would be rawer and more nakedly material than much of what drives our own international system. There's also a subtler dimension to consider. In our world, the wealthiest and most powerful nations have the luxury of engaging in ideological international politics, debating democracy, human rights, multilateral institutions. Those conversations happen against a backdrop of basic food and climate security that most major powers take for granted. In a glacial world at an equivalent technological level, that background security simply doesn't exist in the same way. Even prosperous, sophisticated nations are never more than a few bad harvests, or a significant glacial advance away from a genuine survival crisis that would shape political culture in profound ways, making pragmatism a higher value than ideology, making territorial control a more constant preoccupation, and making the question of what you owe to people freezing outside your borders one of the defining moral tensions of every generation. The ice doesn't just change the map, it changes the political imagination of every civilization that has ever lived beneath its shadow. That question of what you owe to people freezing outside your borders points towards something deeper, a question that runs beneath all of the geopolitics, all of the technology, all of the civilizational ingenuity we've traced through this alternate world. It's the question of whether permanent cold ultimately produces stronger human beings or more desperate ones. Whether the unrelenting pressure of an Ice Age world forges resilience, or simply enforces a kind of chronic fragility that no amount of clever adaptation can fully overcome. The optimistic case starts with human ingenuity itself. There's a compelling argument that adversity, applied consistently and over long periods, selects for exactly the qualities that produce durable civilizations. Societies that must solve hard problems to survive, that can't afford complacency, that must innovate in food storage, shelter, clothing, fuel efficiency, and resource allocation, develop institutional habits of problem-solving that softer environments might never demand. You could look at historical analogies from our own world. The Norse adapted to conditions that would have broken less determined peoples. Andean civilizations developed agricultural systems of breathtaking complexity in response to altitude and cold. The cultures of Siberia and the circumpolar north found ways to not just survive, but sustain rich social and spiritual lives in environments that seem almost incompatible with human flourishing. Permanent cold, on this reading, doesn't destroy civilization, it shapes it toward a particular kind of toughness. And there's something to that. In the alternate world we've been building, the civilizations that manage to persist and expand are precisely those that develop the strongest institutions around collective resource management, long-range planning, and technological adaptation. You don't build a viable society in marginal cold conditions without the kind of social cohesion that comes from shared necessity. There's evidence from our own history that resource scarcity, when it doesn't simply annihilate a community, sometimes produces extraordinarily sophisticated responses, complex redistribution systems, refined ecological knowledge, innovative engineering. A civilization forged across thousands of years of glacial pressure would plausibly have deep institutional memory around exactly those challenges. But here's where the optimistic case starts to strain. The resilience that cold builds tends to be resilience against cold, and that's a narrower quality than it might seem. Societies that are highly adapted to one kind of ongoing stress can be surprisingly brittle when facing different or compounding stresses. A civilization whose entire social organization revolves around managing caloric scarcity and fuel resources may lack the surplus capacity to respond to novel crises, epidemics, volcanic eruptions, internal political collapse that require flexible redirecting of labor and resources. Toughness and adaptability are not the same thing, and an Ice Age world may produce plenty of the former while limiting the latter. The demographic picture is one of the starkest constraints. In a world where habitable land is genuinely limited and agricultural yields are perpetually suppressed by cold, the ceiling on total human population is significantly lower than what our world achieved. And population size matters enormously for civilizational capability. Dense populations produce the labor surpluses that build infrastructure. They generate the market demand that drives economic specialization and technological innovation. They provide the pool of minds from which scientific breakthroughs and artistic revolutions emerge. A world of chronic nutritional stress and limited habitable territory is, almost certainly, a world of smaller total population. And that matters not just in a humanitarian sense, but in terms of what any civilization can actually accomplish over time. Nutrition specifically deserves attention here. Cold climates constrain dietary diversity in ways that have real consequences for long-term public health. The rich agricultural variety that enabled nutrition-based population growth in warmer parts of our world, the grains, legumes, fruits, root vegetables available across multiple growing seasons, would be contracted in an Ice Age world to a narrower range of cold-tolerant crops and preserved or hunted animal protein. Populations living at the margins of habitable zones would face chronic micronutrient deficiencies, higher infant mortality rates, reduced average life expectancy, and greater vulnerability to infectious disease. These aren't abstract problems. They translate directly into reduced intellectual and physical capacity at the population level, and they compound over generations in ways that no amount of cultural toughness can fully offset. The disease environment is also worth considering carefully. Our world's great epidemic diseases, the ones that shaped human history so catastrophically, from plague to smallpox to influenza, emerged largely from the conditions that dense agricultural civilization created. Large settled populations, domesticated animals in close proximity, trade networks spanning continents. An Ice Age world with lower population density and more constrained connectivity between habitable zones might actually see fewer of those catastrophic epidemic events, simply because the conditions for their spread are less favourable. That could be a genuine advantage. But it's also worth noting that when epidemic disease does reach a population that has been living in relative isolation, the consequences can be even more devastating precisely because immunity has never been built up. The geography of an Ice Age world would create exactly those isolated, low-exposure populations, and the history of what happens when isolated groups meet infectious disease in our own world is not encouraging. There's also the environmental risk dimension to consider. Ice Ages are not static. Even within a permanent glacial maximum, there are fluctuations, years when glaciers advance, when sea ice expands, when growing seasons shorten. In our world, societies built their planning horizons around relatively stable climatic baselines. In a glacial world, those baselines are inherently less stable, and the consequences of a bad year or a bad decade are amplified by the fact that there's no agricultural surplus to absorb the shock. Civilizations operating permanently near the margins of their food supply systems have very little buffer. A single major volcanic eruption, the kind that temporarily suppresses global temperatures by a degree or two, could push marginal agricultural zones into complete failure. In a world already living close to the edge, that kind of event isn't a disaster. It's potentially a civilization-ending cascade. So when you weigh it all up, the honest answer is probably this. An Ice Age humanity would be tougher in certain measurable ways and catastrophically more fragile in others. The constant pressure of cold would produce real adaptive capacity, stronger institutions around collective survival, deeper practical knowledge of ecological limits, a political culture oriented toward material security over abstract ideology. But it would do so at the cost of the abundance that makes civilizations genuinely expansive. Lower populations, constrained nutrition, limited surplus, narrower trade networks, and perpetual proximity to catastrophe. These aren't qualities that great leaps of human achievement are built on. They're qualities that describe a species that has survived, that has endured, that has perhaps built something genuinely admirable under nearly impossible conditions. But survival and flourishing are different destinations, and the ice, for all the resilience it forges, consistently makes the distance between them wider. So after everything, the frozen coastlines, the compressed migration corridors, the delayed agriculture, the cities built around thermal survival, the empires constrained by geography, the religions shaped by darkness and cold, what do we actually have? What is the civilization that ice would allow? It's worth stepping back from the individual threads and seeing the whole picture at once, because the most striking thing about this alternate world isn't any single divergence from our own timeline. It's how completely every layer of human experience interconnects when the foundation shifts. Climate doesn't just change the weather, it changes where people go, and where people go determines what they eat, and what they eat determines how many of them there are, and how many there are determines what they can build, and what they can build determines who has power, and who has power shapes what gets believed and remembered and passed down. Pull on one thread, the end of an ice age, and the entire tapestry reweaves itself. In this frozen world, humanity almost certainly exists in a more dispersed, more fragile, and more regionally isolated state than the one we actually inherited. The habitable zones we identified, the lower latitudes, the sheltered coastal margins, the river valleys sitting at the edge of glacial influence, would concentrate human activity into a smaller total footprint. That concentration wouldn't necessarily produce the density that drives civilizational acceleration. More likely it would produce something more like a collection of durable regional cultures, each highly adapted to its particular niche, each deeply knowledgeable about its local ecology, but separated from the others by barriers that never fully dissolved. The civilizational fingerprint looks different in almost every dimension. Agriculture, if it emerged at all in the forms we recognize, would have done so later, more tentatively, and around a narrower set of cold-tolerant crops, making the surplus economy that built our earliest cities significantly harder to achieve. Towns would exist, but the explosive urban growth that characterized the ancient Near East, the Indus Valley, and early China depended on agricultural abundance that a glacial world consistently withholds. Trade networks would form along whatever geographic corridors remained open, but those corridors would be fewer, more difficult, and more vulnerable to climatic fluctuation. Knowledge would travel more slowly. Innovation would diffuse across larger distances with more friction. Power in this world concentrates around resources rather than ideas. Whoever controls the fuel, the protein, the arable land, that entity, whether tribe or city or early state, holds leverage that no abstract ideology can easily challenge. The empires we imagined, if they formed at all, would be more practically oriented, more preoccupied with logistics and survival than with the monumental ideological projects that characterized great civilizations in our own history. The pyramids, the great philosophical schools, the religious architectures of faith that outlasted the states that built them. All of these required surplus, and surplus requires warmth. Cold civilizations build what they need. Warm civilizations build what they dream. And yet, and this is worth holding on to, the civilization that ice would allow is not nothing. It would be real and human, and in many ways admirable. The cultures that survived and adapted across thousands of years of glacial pressure would carry within them accumulated ecological knowledge of extraordinary depth. Their relationship to the natural world would likely be more intimate and more practically sophisticated than anything our own industrialized civilization has maintained. Their social institutions built around collective survival rather than individual accumulation might reflect a kind of practical wisdom about interdependence that modernity spent centuries trying to unlearn. There would be art and story and meaning, because humans make those things regardless of temperature. The ice doesn't freeze the imagination, it just redirects it. But here is the larger insight that this entire exercise keeps pushing toward, the one that matters most, as we close out this thought experiment. The end of the Ice Age wasn't simply a climate event. It was very plausibly a civilizational turning point disguised as a geological one. The roughly 10,000 years since the glaciers retreated have been, by almost any measure, the most consequential period in human history. Agriculture, cities, writing, science, industry, global connectivity, essentially everything we think of as the human story happened in that narrow window of relative climatic warmth. That is not a coincidence. The warming created conditions. The conditions created possibilities. The possibilities, accumulated across generations, created us, which means the world we actually inhabit, with all its complexity, its technology, its 8 billion people, its ongoing and genuinely catastrophic climate disruptions, is in a very real sense the product of a climatic accident. Not of human genius operating in a vacuum, but of human genius operating in exactly the right thermal moment. Our civilizational achievements are real, but they were also in some fundamental way unlocked by a planet that decided, for reasons of orbital mechanics and ocean circulation patterns, to warm up at just the right time. Small changes in Earth's climate state can redirect all of history. That's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It's what the evidence suggests when you follow it seriously. The alternate world we've traced through this conversation is darker, smaller, more isolated, and more precarious than our own. It is also a world of undeniable human endurance, but it is not a world that reaches the stars, or sequences a genome, or argues about the nature of consciousness in published journals. That world, our world, required warmth to exist. And that, more than anything else this thought experiment teaches us, is something worth understanding.